What's everyone's thoughts on what's happening in Afghanistan? Serious. Mysterious Character 8 said, "Honestly, my thoughts are on the poor women over there. It's awful." Balkursdison said, "I'm sure many people would love to put the blame on someone in the executive branch, be it Biden or Trump or Bush or whomever. But really, this is the best answer. It was inevitable. History has taught us this. The Afghan terrain mixed with knowledge of terrain and how to manipulate, terrorize until they get what they want. The local population meant the Taliban could hide work underground for years and simply resurface once the foreign militaries pulled out. Pretty sure everyone was a bit surprised it only took 2 weeks, but other than that, yeah, inevitable. Other than nuking the whole country, which no one is suggesting is a good idea, and starting over in 10 years, I've never heard a plan that I thought would remotely have a chance at working." Hulkblog said, "This is why military might can't fix most of the world's problems. Equipping and training a native army doesn't help if the local government doesn't have the political capital and resources to build government structures that can support and supply the general population and the army." Food Fighter said, "Trouble is, Afghanistan isn't America. I don't mean that in a good or bad way, it just is that way." Someone on Reddit previously posted about how the Afghan culture has not gone through the 800 years of struggle from the Magna Carta in England leading up to the formation of the USA with its own history and internal trials and tribulations. Afghan society is still largely as it has been for likely 1,000 years. You can't just drop a whole bunch of foreign expectations distilled down over centuries onto a country and expect them to embrace it in the span of a few years. Skeptical said, "Yee. Look up the number of civilian casualties. The problem with doing good things while accidentally killing hundreds of thousands of civilians is you're still killing hundreds of thousands of civilians while doing them. I'm unlikely to care much that you built a hospital in a neighboring province when my entire extended family was just blown up in a drone strike or mowed down by a helicopter-mounted minigun, for example. If a serial killer donates the majority of their salary to charity for decades, they're still a serial killer. The good doesn't come close to canceling out the bad." Mark Thwee said, "World War II is often cited by many people as being the model and it's not bad. But General Marshall's plan had one distinct feature. Both Germany and Japan were industrial powers, and along with the rest of the industrialized world, were able to rebuild. Afghanistan was a marginal industrial state, but that was so long ago it clearly doesn't matter. The whole concept of nation-state doesn't really play here. Pashto, Haredi, Tajik, Taliban, Sunni, Shia all mixed, and sometimes in violent combination. And this is the major defect in not just the thinking of the United States, but in the thinking of every foreign interest that has come here to get their arrogance checked for the last couple of thousand years. So maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, we should take a hard and serious look at what we have. The Pashto and other tribes are resilient in a way that has endured every imperial ambition since antiquity, and so maybe it's worthwhile to ask these people what they want for themselves. Ask around, see what is agreeable to them. That's why the Taliban are so fucking successful here, is that they play to all the notional values that are attractive to the tribal powers that exist here. Those tribal powers aren't interested in perhaps any of the values of Western society, but they do have interests." Mark Thwee said, "The United States has a variety of good and virtuous things in its society, but not all of them translate at all. So take giving women rights or introducing programming in high-tech consumer society to individuals who might never earn in a decade enough money to buy a laptop or an iPhone, and far more unfathomable and disturbing to Western thinkers, is that these folks might have absolutely no interest in doing so, ever. So as the Taliban reasserts itself, it's a very dark time for Afghani young people and Afghani women in particular. What might be required for places like Afghanistan or Africa, or Indonesia, or interior China and India and every other place in the world, is to first listen very carefully to what the people in these places want, what are they interested in, and perhaps most importantly, what don't they care about. This forces us then to confront another serious concern, which is to wonder, what about women's rights, prisoner rights or child slavery or whatever other item that is of critical importance to folks in the Western world? What Afghanistan has taught us, if we are wise, is that there are real cultural limits to the virtues of Western society, not because the women and sympathetic culture of Afghanistan might not want those ideals, but rather that nobody took the time, the long, Decades and decades long time to slowly change the culture of the Afghani tribes, from the inside out, rather from the outside in. Marx we said. And we know that resisting outside in change is something the Afghani people are perhaps supremely resistant to that sort of change. So if one fine day the elderly leader of some Pashto tribe emerges from her tribe's madrasa to head over to the tax office to discuss industrial credits for the new microprocessor plant in Herat, with the tablet 45 with her digitally autographed copy of AI programming in Linux as translated by one of the scholars at the school, we'll know it was because the Pashto tribes had chosen to embrace those changes, and not a moment before. Piraner said, I wonder if the timetable paradox has more to do with this than culture. In all those countries the US built permanent bases and basically committed to sitting there forever, which is what prevented communist China and Russia from taking over. I think the Cold War would have gone way differently if the US looked like it would leave within 20 years of World War II because it was tired. The unfortunate thing about forever wars is that commitment to fighting them is just about the only way to end the fighting, which is why the US has a permanent presence all over the world. I am not saying that we should have offered Afghanistan the same treatment, but short of glassing Pakistan for training and sheltering the Taliban, the only way to stop the fighting would have been to scorch-earth the Taliban out of Afghanistan with another surge, then plop a permanent presence on the border and threaten retaliation to anyone crossing it. I don't think the Biden administration had the political capital for such action. People wanted out. Piraner said, of course, a growing number of people want out of the rest of the US's commitments too, and US allies regularly shit themselves throughout the Trump administration over fears that the US might stop providing permanent protection. Now Russia is testing the waters in Europe and China is saber-rattling around Taiwan, and if the US's isolationist streak ever causes us to withdraw from our other commitments, we might learn the hard way that much of the world is one broken promise away from being Afghanistan. Timetables for a military objective just give enemies a time limit to wait it out, but even permanent presence is just a timetable based on perceived patience. Most of the worst actors on the international stage believe they will see the US blink before their dictatorships or terrorist organizations lose funding. Hayek said, a big difference here is that those countries you listed were fairly advanced in society development and culture, to the point of having a centralized government and national identity with perceivable and mostly recognized geographical borders, plus functional strong economy and infrastructures, or at least the knowledge and experience on how to build them in the first place and how to rebuild after getting bombed to dust. Afghanistan is a region with its borders drawn pretty much haphazardly if not arbitrarily by foreign power, consisting of loosely connected tribes, with no clear common national identity, and its economy and infrastructure were never really that good to begin with. Things just can't work the same, not without a few centuries for the changes to really take root in people's collective mindset. Tracker FF said that Afghanistan isn't some homogeneous or uniform country, where everyone will unite against Taliban. Some people will be staunchly pro-Taliban, others will be anti-Taliban. It's impossible for us Westerners to put ourselves in their shoes, which is unfortunately why bringing democracy to such countries is almost always a non-starter to begin with. Yes, I think it is unfortunate that hardcore fundamentalists will be able to control the daily lives of so many different people, but in all honesty, what can you do, without breaking up a country? Saltwater 73 said, why is it that the fundamentalists can gain as much control over the people, if the people don't want to live like this? Why can't the people, with help from others, fight back to get to a life that they desire? And what is the end goal of Taliban ownership over Afghanistan, when even within this group, there is constant infighting? I'm curious to get your thoughts, because your points are well thought out and I'd love to get opinions based on strong knowledge of the area. My ancestry is not too far from there, so I understand the culture somewhat. But I still can't wrap my head around what the people want to desire, why they can't get to that point, and what the Taliban's end goal is, because it feels like their goal is to kill every Afghani and then some. Office UK said, gaining power isn't always dependent on having the support of the majority. It seems to me that the Taliban is winning because they are more unified and have better loyalty and morale. It doesn't matter much how many are against the Taliban, if they can't organize into a coherent group to oppose them. The Afghan National Army can't stand against them if the soldiers lack confidence in their commanders, or if the NCOs do a poor job of maintaining discipline and keeping the respect of those under them. or if soldiers lack belief in the competence and resolve of the rest of the army. Once the army falls apart, as it seems to be doing have done, then there is no organized group to coordinate anti-Taliban activities, unless until some grassroots rebellion forms. For the moment, for an anti-Taliban Afghan, the options are basically to grab a rifle and take pot shots at any Taliban you see until they inevitably find and kill you, or keep your head down and try to keep yourself and your family safe. Unsurprisingly, the first option seems unattractive to most people. Tracker FF said, I have a question about the arms and vehicles that the Taliban are capturing. Did the US leave those behind, or did the Afghan forces leave them when they surrendered? Anna got them from the US, and then put them down when they surrendered. AFAIK, Taliban has said that anyone that surrenders with no fight will be let go unharmed, or given the chance to join them. It's the that fight back that will get no quarter. So right now, Anna soldiers are surrendering left and right, while the special forces and commandos are fighting back. They probably know that surrender will result in executions. Native Masshole said, exactly. You can't just roll in, force a civil war, and then expect to restabilize the country like that. I think, as Americans, we've both romanticized the idea of revolution and also underestimate how complicated civil wars can be. We're lucky that both of these events in our country only resulted in several years of full-scale war. But if you look at our Civil War especially, the destabilization which both caused it and came after have lasted for the majority of our country's existence. It's absolutely arrogant to believe that we could unify a foreign nation when we still have people flying Civil War flags at home. Drasinit22 said, that's the thing. In the 19th century, the British Empire fought 2 wars in Afghanistan, as part of their Cold War with Russia. The first one ended in disaster and the second one ended up with a British protectorate that lasted 40 years until the Afghans beat them out of the country. Then the Soviets fought 3 wars in Afghanistan, the last of which was to prop up the government that had universal education and equal rights for women, but because it was a Soviet satellite, the United States had to stick our big fat fucking faces in it and help destabilize the country and provide aid to the Taliban because hey, who cares about the welfare of people if we can fuck with the Soviets? Finally, we've spent 20 years paying for what we've done. It was obvious that no matter what kind of logistical support or training we give them, that the minute we left, the Taliban was back in again. In many cases, the Taliban just negotiated with various villages and simply took over without so much as an illusion of a fight. It was never going to be possible to spread American ideals to this country, and we spent a lot of money and blood in trying to do it. Enough is enough. That's what Jasades said. I read this comment on another thread and it sums it up for me. From all the news I've seen over the past several years, I thought the Taliban had been reduced to a few foot soldiers left hiding in caves. I thought that America's military presence in Afghanistan had bombed their assets, killed their leaders, and disrupted their command structure, and that Afghanistan was now having free and fair elections and its citizens were enjoying expanded rights under a new constitution. But in reality, the place was taken over by a force of like 75k Taliban in less than a week. What the fuck was a foolie going on over there? Bayikra said. It was shocking how quickly it happened, but not that shocking if you look closer at things. They did have some, mostly I think, fair elections, but I think the last one was heavily disputed, and then part of the problem was that American forces were doing all the heavy lifting to defend against the Taliban. The Afghan army was weak and many of its troops deserted but still existed on paper so that corrupt military officials could steal their wages. It was never a strong government. The Taliban were always lurking and ready to attack. They were just kept mostly confined to rural areas. Also, the human rights situation wasn't that great. Much better than under the Taliban, I guess, but that's a damn low bar. Shadows in Time said. From August 3rd. Afghanistan. Advancing Taliban execute detainees. Police, civil servants detained incommunicado in Ghazni, Malistan, Kandahar. https://www.hrw.org/news/2021/03/Afghanistan-advancing-Taliban-execute detainees. It doesn't look good for Kabul residents. The Taliban has been killing people that served in the Afghan military or police force and tricking others into coming forward, with promises they won't be hurt. to only vanish or be murdered later. I'm scared for them. A journalist from Malistan, a region, who has been tracking detentions there since Taliban forces took control of the district on July 13, said that they entered houses searching for members of the security forces and government employees. They claimed that they would not hurt anyone and they encouraged people to inform those who have escaped from the area to come back to their houses. In practice, they have acted differently. They search houses and, in some cases, even show photos of government employees, asking for their location. Shadows in Time said. He said that the Taliban had killed at least 19 security force personnel in their custody, along with a number of civilians. Taliban fighters also burned down the house of Abdul Hakim Shujoili, a former militia commander who had worked with US forces. Human Rights Watch was unable to confirm the exact numbers killed there. Human Rights Watch obtained a list of 44 men from Spin Boldak, Kandahar, whom the Taliban have allegedly killed since July 16. All had registered with the Taliban before being summarily executed. Wahidullah, a police commander from Spin Boldak, had obtained a forgiveness letter from the Taliban, but Taliban fighters took him from his house and executed him on August 2. Activists and media monitoring these detentions in Kandahar said. Anas Rabang said. Whenever I hear Afghanistan news these days I just remember the first days in my country Yemen when the rebels Houthis started to gain power. I think the same will happen in Afghanistan. The importance of Afghanistan to the Americans has vanished. I don't think USA will do anything there. All foreign representations will leave the country. If Taliban stayed in Afghanistan, they will rule eventually and the world will accept them. If they try to invade Pakistani lands, which what will probably happen in a year or so, there will be a regional semi-international move to stop them and have embargo on Afghanistan. Marijuana Guy said. Iranian here. I don't care about countries pulling out troops. It's not their war and they shouldn't risk their own soldiers. What I'm disgusted by is just the lack of kinship from these countries. The people of Afghanistan need humanitarian aid right now. The Talibans are savage animals who torture people. There's videos surfacing of them stealing children as sex slaves, and probably for human trafficking. It's all really the Afghan government's fault, but the people are the ones who will suffer the worst, and I think we have a responsibility as human beings to save each other in dire circumstances. Busted Bud said. We should have gotten the people who wanted out before we pulled out, and we shouldn't have pulled during fighting season. We should have pulled out during the poppy harvest so there weren't so many people with nothing better to do than to take up arms, and the government has a chance before facing full-on warfare. This was inevitable and was what was going to happen ever since we invaded the country to find a Saudi who was in Pakistan. It's terrible, but we never should have invaded Afghanistan in the first place. And Biden is going to take the blame for this when it really belongs with Bush and his willingness to go kill people to look like he was doing something. 86th Woofer said. It's the outcome of a series of poor decisions being made by many individuals in multiple countries. It seems to me that the immediate cause is that no one has any confidence that things could be made any better. The US, the Afghani government, the other world powers, and even the people on the ground seem to view everything with a certain sense of inevitability, which makes it inevitable because no one has any further willingness to fight against a likely outcome. It further demonstrates the inability of the current world powers to realize the long-held dream of creating an international order capable of aiding peoples all around the world and resolving international and international conflicts. This seems like a net negative for people's faith in governments. I think it's a bitter pill for the US to swallow, and I fear it'll lead to a period of American withdrawal from the world stage which is not being adequately compensated for by the other world powers. A lack of global consensus on the direction for the future bodes ill for the ordinary person who might suffer from increased international competition for power and prestige. 86th Woofer said. Immediately, there will be a lot of suffering as power shifts hands in Afghanistan. I expect that various groups will try to make the best of the situation, and come up with trite conclusions and overly simplistic lessons learned thanks to the benefit of hindsight. I expect the media to spend some time trying to figure out how to explain this to their respective audiences, and ultimately we'll end up with a few narratives about what went wrong which will focus on the big picture and try to tie everything to some broad generalizations about Afghanistan and its people and how this was doomed from the start because of their usual targets of criticism. In another 10-20 years, Someone will conclude that they fully understand how everything could have been done better and scoff at the old guard involved in this conflict. The global order will be different at that time, so new minds will come to the fore with new plans about how to improve the world. Then there will be another regional conflict that shares similarities, but is ultimately different in its nature. The cycle will repeat, as planners attempt to leverage the conflict to make the world a better place. 8/6 Woofer said. To add a little positivity back in, people will continue doing what people do, and many will continue to write their own stories. The cycle of failure is caused by the undercurrent of utopian geopolitics in a world moving faster and faster beyond human control, but individual people may not see it in their own lives, or may never recognize its effects because it plays a minor role relative to everything else happening to them. However, reading some of the other comments, you can see why the cycle continues. I knew better, why didn't they just if only, and the arguments that the actors lacked morality, bravery, rationality, etc. Sometimes I hear people complaining about American exceptionalism, the belief that it'll be different because the US does it. I think this is a real concern, but many fail to realize that the US isn't exceptional in having this mentality. Every country with dreams beyond the present starts imagining that they'll be different, that this time it'll be different, because they know better. Waza 365 said. It's sad to see the country go back to Stone Age, especially on women's rights. But I'm not sure what the answer is. Us, UK etc. were there for 20 years to stabilize the region, force out terrorist forces and equip the Afghan army to defend the country, and it's all been undone in about a month. What would another 5, 10, 20 years have achieved? Maybe another 20 years of relative peace, but feels like insurgent forces are going to pop up the moment NATO forces leave. Us in Europe are not the world police, we've got our own to worry about right now. I don't know what the best way forward is, but the Afghan people need to fight for themselves if they want to get rid of the Taliban. I hate to say it, but the best solution might even be a more moderate Taliban. They do appear to have become more legitimate rather than just a group of rebel fighters, but whether that could ever translate to a peaceful government with reasonable treatment of its population, particularly women, I don't know. Love God 551 said. As a vet I'm torn. Lost a lot of brothers, shed blood and tears. And in less than 2 weeks the entire country folded like a bunch of bitches. I know that's not a popular statement, but it's absolutely the truth. The long-term ramifications are so muddy I don't think anyone has a true idea of what is going to happen, but if history is any indicator there will be massive human suffering, mostly from the Taliban and especially directed towards females. Widespread famine and a massive humanitarian crisis with a huge refugee problem is the most likely scenario. Having said this, I have to say that we could not and should not have stayed as long as we did. Absolute waste of money, lives, and effort. Princess Foxglove said. So, I've seen a lot of Afghanis need to just take control of this themselves, and I even saw replies like "this is your fault and your responsibility" on Facebook to a lovely young woman who identified as being an Afghani refugee. I want to share a quick experience I had that made me think about what it feels like to be powerless. I moved to the Middle East this year from a Western country. I know Afghanistan is not technically in the Middle East, it's in Central Asia, but that's not important for this story. I came in as a white, relatively privileged woman during a low COVID period, but I was on one of the first flights into the country, which had been on totally national lockdown for months, no one in or out. The airport was literally lined with military with extremely large guns that were in hands or slung over shoulders. We were kept on the plane for hours, then finally let out into a secure area for a few more hours while we had rapid tests performed. During this time, we had no access to food or water. We were told where to go and what to do, and there was a lot of yelling and a lot of tension. Then after hours we finally were able to go through customs and were immediately loaded into buses based on pre-booked quarantine hotel locations and slips of paper that we couldn't read as they were in Arabic. Princess Foxglove said. We got on our designated bus, and then after a few minutes, a man came in and yelled at us to leave and get on other bus. We knew it was the wrong bus, but they had big guns, so we didn't argue. We were taken to the wrong quarantine location. Then, despite my husband and I coming on the same flight, being booked at the same quarantine hotel, 2 military men came to the hotel and separated us. They put me in a cab alone and took me separately to a different location. It was going on 9 hours of no food and no water, and several hours at the point of no access to a bathroom. We did manage to find each other again at the new quarantine location, but all the incoming people had to wait outside the hotel for another 2 hours as they logged people in. The hotel was blockaded off with military as well. It took 11 hours before we got in and got water, and another hour or so before we got food. Now, during this whole experience, I was still relatively safe. It's a friendly country and most of this was just disorganization and big guns, which are scary. But during the whole process I realized just how utterly powerless I was and how just a few hours without food and water, like literally not having it and not knowing where you can get it, can make you weak and scared. Princess Foxglove said. So imagine people who have been living under that kind of powerlessness for years, or decades, or their entire lives. Imagine a group of armed, angry men who have a long history of not treating people kindly and who have very little incentive not to kill, torture, or rape you swarming into your city. It's so totally unfair when people just flippantly say, well, it's their problem now, because it's not. It's not just their problem, because a lot of the people whose burden it has become are women, children, frightened, hungry, powerless people who have had no agency their whole lives because men with big guns are right there. And then also neighbors who can't wait to take advantage of the powerless are also right there, so who can you trust? My heart breaks for people there. Negative Divide said. I'm increasingly irritated by people happily crowing that the USA lost, because that supposes that our objectives were not met. I think the true objectives were in fact reached. Namely, to enrich contractors and extract unbelievable amounts of money, as much as possible for as long as possible. I think this is a business model that started in Vietnam and has continued since. It truly is a parasitic and miserable industry designed almost entirely to feed off of public money. And what irritates me about this is that, by so many people failing to catch wise, it will happen again. They're probably already planning their next heist. P.S. My money is on it being Iran. They've been eyeballing that cash cow for ages. 3-Foot Kangaroo said. As someone who studies the politics of the region for a living, I wish people would stop thinking that cynicism is an acceptable substitute for a political opinion. Saying America didn't achieve anything doesn't make you hip or woke or perceptive, it makes you look dumb. It's a disaster, yes, but the situation is an order of magnitude more nuanced than people are willing to accept, and exclusively blaming the US for it is patently ignorant. I'm not American, nor a big supporter of US foreign policy in Central Asia and the Middle East, but the hot takes on this website and even in the media make me want to pull my hairs out. Morton said. Leaving was the right thing to do. If it's still unstable after 20 years, billions of dollars and so many lives lost, then this rebuilding is never going to work. The only thing that might is probably to just overthrow everything and create a new country from scratch, but seeing how Kosovo is doing right now, that is probably going to be a big failure as well, and looks really bad on the West. The Taliban reclaiming provinces was to be expected, I guess, but not at this pace. It also shows how much of a waste these 20 years were and that they made the right call to leave. It was a failed state, is a failed state and will be a failed state for a long time. What is really pissing me off right now is how little our government, Dutch, to help the Afghan people who helped the Dutch on our missions. They were working on it, but now it's too late and most of them are stuck in provinces already in Taliban hands.